joining me right now to crunch these budget figures is Johnson Chukwu, who is the MD CEO of Carry Asset Management, an investment bank based in Lagos. Mr. Chukwu, thank you very much for joining us on the program. We're back here just after a couple of months ago now talking about a new budget. Not quite long ago when we talked about the 2018 budget. This year, of course, not last year. But it's a good thing that we're having to discuss the 2019 budget this year, even though somehow I think it's coming very late. I know you don't work for government, and of course you're not a government minister or all of that. But can you just help us understand why our budgets always come this late?
Well, it might be difficult for one to answer that question. I think the Minister of National Budget and Planning should be in a better position to answer that. Because they actually, it's not rocket science. It doesn't take anything specially for the government to prepare its budget and have it sent to the National Assembly on time. I do not imagine that it's an impossibility or such a difficult thing. There are timelines specified in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that if they abide by those timelines, they should actually have the budget, which should be talking of signing the 2019 budget and not presenting the 2019 budget. That budget should have been presented sometime in October or thereabouts. And then the National Assembly will have 2-3 months to review it and have it passed into law. But now that we're presenting the budget in December, particularly in a year that is an election period, I think the budget approval process might not be concluded until after the end of the election season.
And that's going to be a big worry because, you know, I would think that, well, since the budget has now been presented, that the lawmakers could speedily pass it. But I really doubt if that's going to happen, pass it before the elections. But anyway, let's leave that aside and let's talk about the figures altogether. A budget of 8.83 trillion naira. You look at, you know, the breakdown of the budget. What's your take?
Well, apart from let's look at two aspects of it. The breakdown of the budget, which says we'll be spending about 4 trillion on recorded expenditure, 2 trillion on capital expenditure, 2.14 trillion on debt service. I think if you consider those factors, you realize that the capital expenditure budget of about 2.03 trillion is just 22% of the total budget.
Now, couldn't this be explained? Could this be as a result of the fact that the president had to factor in, you know, the new national minimum wage now into the budget?
I don't even think the new national minimum wage is there because if you look at current recorded expenditure of the government, it's in the region of that 4 trillion. But if you bring in the new
minimum wage,
I believe the recorded expenditure will be much higher.
But the president did say
the
budget, I mean the 2019 budget captures the new minimum wage.
Because if you talk of capturing the minimum wage, what already did they capture it? Is it at 30,000 naira to?
Well, that we do not know.
Or, so for you to talk of capturing it in that budget, then you must also have made an assumption on what the minimum wage will be. And I'm not aware that they have agreed on any figure. So that might be, whatever they put there will be highly speculative, assuming it is even there. But I can assure you that those figures don't look like they contain a material increase in the wage bill, which the minimum wage will bring about. But beyond that, the greater concerns are that we might not have the headroom. The government may not even have the resources to spend on capital expenditure. The recorded expenditure and the debt service expenditure of 2.14 trillion are what you call their compulsory expenses. They are not discretionary. They are, or what do you say? They are non-discretionary expenses. So whatever happens, the government must incur the recorded expenditure as long as the economy is run the way it is run, or that the public sector remains as large as it is. And then the debt service obligation is also non-discretionary. That takes you to already 6 trillion. And the government budget is under threat. The government revenue projections will be threatened by the drop in crude price and for me, the overambitious 2.3 million barrels per day production that was
and that is one thing I find difficult to understand. Why is it that, look, almost year in, year out, we we budget 2.3 million barrels of oil per day, but in fact, we know that that's overly optimistic, and that we never get we never get that amount of oil. 2018, I mean the passing year now, 2.3 million barrels of oil, but we didn't pump, as the president even said it, that at some point, well, we managed to come up to 1.95. The year before that, it's always been the tradition. Why is it like that?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's just basically a figure they put there to create an impression that, so to enable them to assume a higher revenue base so they can actually project a higher expenditure base. Budget, because without an assumed revenue base of that size, it will be difficult for them to justify the budget deficit should not exceed more than 3%. But reality is that there's no year in, year out that we've achieved a budget deficit that's less than 3%. Because reality is that we've not met our revenue projections for the past 3 years. So if we continue projecting at that level, the only logical assumption would be that we need to project, though the projection is highly optimistic, it's unrealizable, it forms the basis to also project the expenditure that government end up not being able to.
You just said something very important. For the past 3 years, we've not been able to meet the revenue projection. And to be candid, it would appear the biggest challenge we face at the moment, and for quite a while now, has been that of revenue. You look at the budget, it might look good, but when it comes to revenue, how to fund the budget, that has always been our challenge. What do we need to do to improve our revenue collection, to improve revenue? Because at the end of the day, if we're not able to generate the revenue we need to fund this budget, everything comes to naught.
Well, one of the areas of improvement should be in terms of tax revenue. The government needs to improve our tax administration and collection system so that it becomes easier for companies to pay and the taxes don't look very punitive. We should leverage on modern technology to improve. I know there has been a lot of improvement in that area. Then the other aspects is that the government has to review its strategy for funding capital expenditure, because the reality is that there's a limit to what you can grow the revenue suddenly within a short period of time. So if you can't grow the revenue and the revenues is so that we end up borrowing for the entire capital expenditure of the government, then we need to ask ourselves, at what can we continue to borrow? There must be a limit to borrowing. Today, we're already over-leveraging when you talk of debt service to government revenue. If you talk of debt service to GDP, you may think it's quite low, but debt service to government revenue is more than 50%. And
that is why we've just said, look, the problem is revenue, whether or not we like it. So yeah, that's the problem we need to solve, revenue.
Okay, let me tell you the fundamental thing we need that will improve the revenue. We need infrastructure. So one could say, okay, how do we build infrastructure? We cannot build infrastructure from budgetary allocations because the budget will never be enough to build infrastructure. We must introduce private capital into infrastructure development. That's the only way we can build that base that will support a higher revenue for the government. Because if you do not have improved economic activities, you cannot have higher revenue, have a higher tax revenue for the government. It's the level of economic activity that will drive the higher revenue. Otherwise, what you'll be doing is to making the few cows and then make them to death. But the reality is that we should have a growing economy. The economy is growing about 6-7%, and you have jobs being created, you have economic activities being created, then those entities will have the revenue and net income to pay taxes. And for you to have that, you must have a physical or infrastructure environment that supports productive activities, that support private sector. And we don't have that. We don't have the road network. We don't have the power supply. We don't have basic infrastructure that will support productive activities, that will allow private sector to prosper. And that's what will lead to improvement in government revenue.
And let's talk about something else. I mean, we've looked at the budget. Let's look at the benchmarks. We've talked about oil price at 60%. If you ask me, I would say that's somewhat optimistic. At the moment, I think oil will be trading for slightly less than $60. And medium to long term, we don't know how high the price of oil can go. Of course, you've talked about the oil production of 2.3 million barrels per day. That, to me, just as you said, overly optimistic. But what about inflation rate as well? 9.98%, and the government anticipating a GDP growth rate of 3.01%. You think those are realistic?
I think on the inflation rate, we should expect further uptick in inflation. But after the election, assuming we adopt appropriate economic policies, and the election is successful, then we should have a return of foreign portfolio investor that could help stabilize the exchange rate. But should that not happen, the exchange rate will come under pressure, and if the exchange rate comes under pressure, it will be transmitted to the consumer price index. So you could actually see a further northward movement in inflation. But given where we are today and the level we dropped last year, today inflation is about 11.28%. And the government is budgeting about 9.98% inflation for next year. I think it's possible, if we get the policies right, that towards the end of next year, we could be close to that 9.98%, if we don't achieve it exactly. But the other concerns are on the economic growth rate, which is the GDP growth of 3.01%. I think unless the government comes up with better policies, I want to believe that 3% GDP growth rate will maybe a tall order. If you look at those sectors that should drive GDP growth rate, agriculture accounts for about 29% of the GDP, and agriculture grew about 1.91% in the last quarter. So if the 1/3 of the GDP is growing about 1.91%, then what sectors will prepare that growth rate of 3%? Unless the manufacturing sector is growing above current growth rate, trade is growing, telecommunication is growing, and oil and gas sector reverses the decline, then your target of 3% GDP growth rate looks quite optimistic. Remember that this year we are just oscillating between below 2%. And unless we have new policies, the current policies will not drive a GDP growth of 3%.
And what's your take on the oil price, the benchmark, $60 per barrel?
The oil price, I want to believe before the National Assembly will finish the review of the budget, they will have to bring it down. This will be, otherwise, it will be the first time we have an oil benchmark price that at the point of the budget submission or approval was higher than the crude price.
The prevailing crude price.
We always say the benchmark significantly below the crude price, so that assuming the crude prices fluctuate, they will fluctuate still above our budget benchmark. But unfortunately for us, this time around, the crude price had dropped below the benchmark. So the National Assembly, I'm sure, will want to reduce that crude price to reflect the current strength of the oil in the oil market.
Let me ask you one question. I know you're not a lawmaker, but if you were talking to the lawmakers now, don't you think they should take this as a national emergency? I'm talking about the budget now. Take it as a national emergency and say from January next year, probably designate the next, the first 2-3 weeks of January to just concentrate on the budget, look at it, and then get it passed, so that we're able to return to these January to December budget cycle.
No, the reality is that that's not feasible. It's not realistic. And I'll tell you why I say it's not realistic. The National Assembly, I want to assume, will go on Christmas recess today. Because next week is...
I know. I'm just saying, would it be out of place for them to, sort of like a national emergency, address this once and for all, and then they can go back to their politicking?
That's why I said that you have to look at, is it feasible? There are processes that the budget undergoes in the National Assembly before it's approved. It has to go to different subcommittees, and then it has to go to the committee. The subcommittee's input will now be brought to the committee on budget. And that process must be they must go through those processes. But beyond that, when you talk of a national emergency, it is not just the National Assembly that should consider budget approval and national emergency. The executive ought to have recognized the season that we are in, and the budget should have gone to National Assembly much, much earlier than now. You can't present the budget when they have a day of legislative, only 1 day of legislative year left. And then you expect them to declare it emergency. Because if it's an emergency, it should have come to them earlier, because there's actually nothing that is sudden about the evolution of time, the passage of time. So we knew that time was counting, and then the one arm of the government delayed. I'm not standing for any arm of government, but I'm just saying that if we consider it a priority, it should cut across both the executive and
absolutely. One last thing I want you to talk about, because it's something that I've always talked about anytime we have the national budget release. The states, as we speak, several state governors are busy signing their state budgets into law. You look at the aggregate of the state's budget, quite massive too. So what do you think these states need to do now to complement, if you like, the national budget? Because it would appear we concentrate so much on the national budget, we just fail to look at the state's budget as well.
You know, interestingly, because we operate an assumed, and I repeat, assumed federal structure, governance structure, there's little the federal government can do to impose budget management on the state other than advisory. But beyond that, I think what the government needs to do, we need to have an economic plan, like we used to have under the Obasanjo government. If you remember, we had a national economic empowerment development needs. And then we had the SEED, which is the State Economic Empowerment Development Program. So that the SEED program was a drill down of the national program, so that each state had key into the national economic plan. I think we need to go back to something close to that, if not the same thing. And so that the federal government will have a national economic development plan and encourage the states to fit into it. That's the way other countries developed. If you look at a country like US, for instance, if the government said we're doing this highway, the state will now do their roads to link up to that highway. And so you now have an integrated network of roads. The same thing should apply in economic management.
But the fact is that citizens also need to keep an eye on their state's budget.
Yeah, for us to achieve that, we need to look at the fundamental reason why states are not, or the arm of state government that should be responsible for carrying out oversight function at the state level are not functional. Because the state legislators are appendages of the state government, the executive. And for that lack of independence, in a lot of states, the state governor influences who gets elected into the state house of assembly, and influences who is not elected. And the state legislators do not have financial autonomy. So they are unable to serve as their oversight function at the state level. We need to address that at the constitutional level. The state legislators should be financially independent of the state governors, so that they can actually supervise or oversee what the executives are doing.
All right, Mr. Chukwu, thank you very much for joining us on the program and for your insights there.
My pleasure.
All right, we'll take a short break and we'll be right back. On Deji 360, we don't just ask the questions. What is wrong with amending the Constitution the way the National Assembly members have been doing it? We seek answers.
Constitution is constituent. Our problem is not lack of laws. Our problem is lack of the willpower to implement our laws.
Answers that provide clarity.
While we negotiate, we should try to make it a point that the girls must be complete.
The clarity you need to make informed judgment so that you can make the right decision and take action. People are saying it is you politicians that are responsible for this, that you are the reason why this is happening.
All these dollars that call themselves governors in this country.
I wish we had people like Tony at the National Assembly.
God forbid that I go to join that panel.
Deji 360, providing clarity to issues.